Okay, everybody, we're recording now. So this is just going to be a follow-up of the start we had in relation to, well, not in relation to, but we were looking at the idea of nuisance, and we stopped at, uh, we're looking at how the nuisance developed for the public and the private sphere, and we're going to be moving to looking at the idea of private nuisance today, and then on Friday we're going to be wrapping up with looking at who can actually be sued under nuisance, which the preview is that it's going to be the creator of the nuisance, whether or not the landlord of the premises where the nuisance is coming from can be sued, and the occupier of the premises. And we're going to be looking on Friday. We're going to be looking at where these three. Sorry, check my phone. I got an email from a student there. Where these three areas overlap, whether they're separate, whether they're distinct, whether they're separate, and why there is a division between the three types. So just a recap of where we're looking at an overview of nuisance, where it comes from, where it was developed, and why public nuisance is a crime. But again, it's a exact magnitude. Why do I look like I'm a faux hawk today? But it is an area that covers a multitude of sins, great and small, so it can go from a minor annoyance to the creation of significant damages. And last week we were looking at the difference between an annoyance that causes a nuisance in the everyday sense and a nuisance in the legal sense, and where that distinction, where that division between the two comes into effect. That was just a public nuisance, an illustration of public nuisance. So we're looking at the idea of where the public nuisance causes particular or special damages to the individual, and how that can go beyond a public nuisance. Because for a public nuisance, only the Attorney General can take the claim. But if you, as the individual, can show there is a particular special damage to you, or you've suffered because of this nuisance, you can then take a case and the required fast. So we were looking then just briefly at the type of nuisances, most common obstructions through highways and dangers, creation of them, creation of stones as tunnels again, and the creation of dangers and what can actually amount as a danger. While it may not seem particularly dangerous, it can lead to significant injury. And so this is where we are now. I'm just looking at the types of danger and going to private nuisance. And private nuisance, you can see there, is really a field of tortious liability rather than a single type of tortious conduct. The features which gives it immunity is the interest evaded out of the use and enjoyment of land. And this is particularly relevant to one of the essay questions you have, as one question asks you to examine the limits of the scope of the enjoyment of your land. Your enjoyment of your land versus your neighbour's enjoyment of their land, and where private nuisance really comes into that. And you can see over at the start there was quite a restrictive approach of who can actually sue, the requirements for the owner, the occupier of the land, and to have the interest. But you can see there that it was who can actually sue and be sued was quite expanded as the years have rolled on. And we've seen at the same time the there was a reduction in the scope of the standard of liability. So while they were expanding in one way, they were reducing or contracting the other. So it wasn't opening floodgates that the most minor inconvenience with no damage became a private nuisance. And while it may be a nuisance in the everyday sense, it wouldn't be this is myself disappearing at the end, or while it would be a nuisance in the everyday sense, it wouldn't give rise to a legal nuisance. And one of the cases that we were looking at before, and one that comes up a lot in relation to nuisance in Ireland, is Hanrack versus Merrick, Sharp and Nunn. And you can see there, clear from the authorities of the law of nuisance, that what an occupier of land is entitled to against his neighbour is the comfort and healthy enjoyment of the land to the degree that would be expected by an ordinary person whose requirements are objectively reasonable in all the particular circumstances. And this is the language that really triggers and gets into the guts of what public nuisance is. Enjoyment of land, a healthy and comfortable enjoyment of land that a reasonable person would be able to enjoy in the ordinary circumstances. And we've been looking at some of the case law in relation to this, and how we look at what is the ordinary use of land, what is the healthy and comfortable enjoyment of land, what trade-off is there. And you'll remember I mentioned a couple of weeks ago in class just offhand, as I read it going in, that there was a question of the enjoyment of privacy. Of you have the right to privacy in your land, you have the enjoyment of the privacy of your own home, but you also have the comfortable, what could be reasonably expected of if you live in a city. If you have floor-to-length windows, like full, entire one side of your house is window, that you will have a beautiful view, but people will also have a beautiful view of you. And that was in the Tate versus case taken by the Tate Museum, Modern Tate in London, where there was a question of they could, as a result of reconstructions and the creation of an observation deck to examine the city, a neighbouring apartment complex had put in a claim of nuisance and privacy infringement, that they were looking, the visitors and guests of the museum were looking into the building, were looking into people's bedrooms or living rooms or whatever. And the question, and really the court said, no, it's a cityscape. This is the impact and the influence and the effect of living in a city. You can see out, they can see it. The fact you have floor to ceiling windows kind of makes it a bit worse. But there was that question of a cityscape, and that's balancing the enjoyment of your land with the enjoyment of others and the rights to do so under nuisance. And you can see there that a private nuisance itself isn't really actionable. There has to be damage, and these damages have to be proven. It can't just be, oh, this caused a nuisance up in the air. It caused the idea of a nuisance. I'm suing for this. There has to be physical injury to the land, a substantial interference with enjoyment. And we're going to be looking at what amounts to substantial a little bit later on. And interfering with servitudes, where the disturbance constitutes a substantial interference with the plaintiff's rights. We're not going to be looking at that one. But it really is just the damages to the land and the substantial interference with the enjoyment of the land. So the example I used last week was if you live beside Crow Park, your enjoyment of a quiet, normally they're quiet streets, but the interference could be concerts going on. Gareth Brooks concerts going on for 8 nights on a row. Not only will there be significant traffic and destruction from the people, the road closures, the actual renovations of the stadium and music that would be played and the harm that could come from it. You would also have to listen to Gareth Brooks for 8 nights in a row. 8 minutes is already questionable, but 8 nights in a row would be significant interference with the enjoyment of the land. But as we'll see later on as well, is how that can be some of the defenses to nuisances. If you are moving to an area besides, say, Crow Park, as I keep saying with the example, you know, or you should have known that it's a busy stadium. Crow Park is used for venues for sport. It's used for venues for music. So you can't move to a house right beside it and then complain about the noise, complain about the body of people who are there on match days or if there's a concert. Because you should have known that this was going to happen. Or it was on you to look at, well, this is a sports arena, stuff happens here. I can't complain about the noise. If you lived there before Crow Park was renovated, before it became the venue it is now, if you were, and by that logic, you'd be quite an elderly individual, you may have that case. Granted, in the Crow Park example, there is the Residency Association that do have an agreement with Crow Park so the nuisance is taken on their behalf. But that is the kind of question. You can't put in a claim for nuisance if you move beside a concert venue saying it's too noisy, if they're there first. If you should have known a concert venue will be creating noise. And while it will be a substantial interference with enjoyment, peace and quiet of your land, of your property, your premises, it is one of the defenses and one of the grounds that you kind of look at. You're moving beside a concert venue. Of course there's going to be noise. But if the venue opens up afterwards, that's where your enjoyment you will be able to take an action for the interference with your own enjoyment. And when we're looking at private nuisance, that there is a certain type of similarity to trespass, and this is looking at the encroachment of trees in particular. There's a lot about trees in this. I kind of regret not using this image in the last one, but the encroachment of trees raises a particular difficulty in this regard, not only because ants are slow and they take forever to decide your networks. What do you do with trees? And with the trees, it's divided into two. It's divided into branches and roots because a tree is a tree. But you have to look at how each kind of works. And you can see there that it's somewhat remarkable that a country so largely agricultural as Ireland, there has been such a marked scarcity of decisions touching upon the rights and liability of occupiers, resulting from the spread of roots or trees beyond the boundaries of their owner's property. And yeah, you think that's right. I think partly it could just be because of common sense. People will say, "Oh, the roots are there; we'll take up the tree." It's before it becomes a nuisance. Other countries will have legal actions for it, or no one cares. But you can see that where the encroachment of the roots onto the property of a neighbour, it causes damages. The encroachment of the roots, so the roots growing through the grass, growing under a fence and knocking it over, growing under a wall, causing structural damage, or the house even, depending on how long and how big, what kind of tree it is. Actually makes sense of Endor behind me now that we're dealing with trees. But the roots and the harm causing from an encroachment would amount to a nuisance. And then when you're seeking the damage for this, you can seek an injunction for the damages to repair walls, structural damage, whatever, an injunction that they have to, that the owner of the property whose trees are creating a nuisance has to take care of it. Or you can abdicate the nuisance yourself. And this is what I imagine is happening more around. That common sense is taking hold, and people see those roots are growing. In 5 to 10 years, there may be some structural issue to the wall or cause structural damage to my house. I can take care of this now. It is the advantage of when you're fighting trees. They are slow moving. They're purposeful, but they're slow moving. And Treebeard from the Lord of the Rings is based on C.S. Lewis. But you can take, you can see there as well on the slide, you can take proactive action against the roots by cutting, sorry, my battery's going to go, by cutting the roots as they're coming onto the property. Now, ideally, you would contact an arborist, which is a fancy word for tree surgeon, rather than trying to cut the tree yourself, or cut the roots yourself, sorry, as they can cause damage to the tree and you would be liable for that, or they can cause the tree to fall over because of a lack of structural supports, and you'd be liable for the damage that came about as the tree falling over. And even if no one's ready to hear it, you still have to pay the penalty. But with branches, generally they are the same as roots, because a tree is a tree. We're not going to get into the semantics of what's the difference between an oak and a chestnut tree for the purpose of law. In a nutshell. No, but just sometimes it is important to be aware of just the difference between branches and roots. Roots will be slow moving, they'll be purposeful, and they'll be underground. But branches can't fall off the trees, they can cause overhanging damages. And that's what they're looking at in Gillen versus Fair. And this is a little different because more likely the roots branches can have an impact on highways. So again, creating a public nuisance, and as well as a private nuisance if they fall onto property. But in this case here, the branch fell as a result of a latent defect of the tree. It was rotten from the inside, and no one could actually see it unless they had fully inspected the tree and there were fully tree doctors, and they could treat the tree from the root, but they hadn't. And a reasonable person wouldn't have been aware of this. And upon reasonable inspection, they couldn't tell the tree was rotten. So when the branches fell as a result of the rot, liability could not be imposed for the nuisance. And at the same time, the courts have to take into account the location of the premises. Looking at how Ireland is, rural versus urban, is there a harm coming from trees in a rural area or an urban area? And should there be a difference in how they're assessed? And that's what the courts are saying that there should be. If it's a tree in the middle of nowhere, it falls over, no one hears it, but it's not really going to be that much of a nuisance. If you have a tree in a garden in a housing estate or in an urban area and that falls over, more than likely it will be causing a nuisance. Or the roots are spreading in a housing estate will cause a nuisance, as opposed to a tree in a field in rural Ireland. Not saying it doesn't cause harm, but they have to look at the circumstances and the situation of where the trees are. And you can also get private nuisance and a physical injury resulting from blasting, so explosives and the vibrations, the debris caused from that coming into the property, vibrations and noise in this, and vibrations causing harm of shattered glass, discomfort, noise, as a good example, are concerts, that can be causing a physical injury. The noise causing hearing loss, as an example. Noise and vibrations will also come into the enjoyment of the land and can constitute a substantial interference with it. But the physical damage created from the noise or vibrations, noise can cause hearing loss, vibration can cause structural damage on housing, particularly if the Who are playing. But they're not going to play out. The creation of dust and dust escaping onto your land, and water, as we've seen in Ryland's Reflector as well, where water is causing a nuisance and harm if water escapes and delays. But the one there that I thought was a bit funny when I was preparing these notes is the accumulation of large numbers of pigeons that overfly the neighbour's property. Of course, went out of their way, and the material went out of their way to avoid saying pigeon poop. But pigeon poop is slightly acidic, and it can cause harm to your property. It can be unsightly, it can cause damage if you clean it, and it can strip paint. It can kind of damage stonework. And these are more likely examples that can come about though. Physical injury of nuisance, the emission of toxic substance, fumes, smoke carrying from excessive heat that pass on to the property, or obstructing heat so that the reduced adjoining property to Arctic condition. And these may seem a bit specific or over the top, but these are actual cases that have been brought to court and held to be physical injury. And that's so the overcreation of too much heat, or the creation of an absence of heat because you do something to your property can create a nuisance, and the harm that results from everything being too hot or too cold. And this brings us to the idea of, while there can be harm from that, they can also give, or they can also create a substantial interference with the land. And you can see there the quote: personal inconvenience and interference with one's enjoyment, one's quiet, and one's personal freedom, anything that composes or injuriously affects the senses or the nerves. So there is quite a broad definition of what is your personal enjoyment. And the enjoyment of land. You have it, you can enjoy it, you can sit out in your garden, you can relax, you can Netflix and chill, you can just sit in solitude, you can have people over, you don't have to worry about neighbors having parties 24 hours a day, or rock and roll part of every day, like the Kiss song. But they were looking at how you enjoy your land and the requirements of this. And you can see there in the Hanrahan versus Merrick, Sharp and Dome case again, the personal discomfort, including affections of nerve and senses. So that's really your mental stakes, that it's causing you harm. You can't relax in your own home, or your own on the premises you have occupation of. And that's the other bit we're looking at later. It is the reasonable enjoyment that you have. You can do nearly whatever you want on your own property or your own premises, but other people have the right not to be affected by that. Like, you have the right to sit in your sofa in your underwear, eating ice cream, or playing video games. Great night in. Doesn't affect anyone, and it is your enjoyment of the land. If you did that in your front garden, or if you did that in front of your neighbor's window, if you had adjoining windows for some reason, that could constitute an interference with their land, that they may not want to have to look out their window and see you sitting in your garden in your underwear, eating ice cream and playing video games. It could be unsightly. That's not a comment on anyone. It's just, I really wouldn't want to see a neighbor sitting in the garden eating ice cream in their underwear. Maybe I need more attractive neighbors. Who knows? But it is a question of where your enjoyment starts and ends, and where your neighbor's enjoyment starts and ends, and how these two boxes effectively aren't just the legal boundaries of the premises, that there is a bit more to it, because they do go back and forth between the two. Sorry, students. Back and forth. And this then goes to the question of what is reasonable, and then reasonable enjoyment. And you can see there is a very broad definition of the substantial interference and enjoyment of land. There's a very broad definition of what enjoyment and interference can be. And a lot of it, unfortunately, is not unfortunately, but fortunately, is the court's taking common sense approach. They look at what is reasonable to be expected between neighbors. You can be a good neighbor. You can be an okay neighbor where you keep yourself and your neighbors keep themselves. You can be a great neighbor where you drop over sugar. Not now. Please don't drop sugar over to your neighbors now. Stay 6 feet away from them at least. More so, especially if, neighbors. Uh, but what is reasonable to expect between neighbors? What is the give and take? And you can see there in the Bradford and Turnley case, the courts will thus apply the principle of a give and take, live and let live. One of the better. No, it's Live and Let Die is the Wing song for the Bond movie. One of the better ones. But it is the question of, there is a back and forth. There will be a real life engagement of real life aspect of this. It's not just legally it says this, legally it says that. The courts have taken a look at this and said, people are people, people will live. There has to be a bit of back and forth. It's a dynamic position, and it's what is reasonable to expect between neighbors, what can be understood or what should be expected. Now, you could be a good neighbor and have a terrible person living next door to you who's always complaining about the slightest infraction. If you put your music up past 5 on a stereo at the middle of the day, or if you, I'm trying to think of bad neighbors example without them causing problems, where they take the slightest offense at you putting out your washing after 6, because they have to look at and see clothes drying in the afternoon. That would be unreasonable for them to claim nuisance. That would be should no way affects their enjoyment of the land. Well, while they may claim it, from a legal perspective, they don't. If you're playing music at full volume, turning it all the way up to 11 at 4 in the morning every weeknight, that would be, you'd be annoying the hell out of your neighbors, and that will be a substantial interference with their enjoyment of the land because they're entitled to sleep. Now, on sleep, actually, I just raised a question of, if you have neighbors and they work day shifts, or sorry, they work night shifts, so they sleep during the day, you may have to take that into account in how nuisance works, especially if they ask, and more so in particular if they will ask, as let's say hypothetically, I'm your next door neighbor, I work nights, I ask just between the hours of say 7 to 2 in the afternoon, that's when I sleep because I work nights. Would you mind not blasting speed metal at between those hours? They could ask, it would be a reasonable request, or could be seen as a reasonable request, and that would be okay if you're blasting that. But if you're consistently playing that music loud during the day, and they've perhaps made a request, if they've asked you and have alerted of the circumstances, you may have to take that into account. If they haven't, you can play music during the day between the hours of 11 and 7 at night. There is an allowance of, you can't have louder music outside of this period. You have to curtail it. And I just know this because I used to play drums quite badly. But during those times, you can make a louder noise. After those hours, you are expected to keep it down. Otherwise, it does count as an interference. And when you're looking at this, they look at this from a couple of grounds. The first one is the utility of the defendant's conduct. Why are they creating this nuisance? And what was the purpose of it? And clear that the law in judging what constitutes a nuisance does take into consideration the object of that which is said to consider a nuisance. Of why is that nuisance actually there? And this isn't so much a defense yet, but they're looking at why a nuisance was created. And again, because of the existence of social and economic contexts, certain allowances have to be made that it won't count as a nuisance. Business activities during the day, during regular trading hours, will create noise and traffic. That will be a nuisance. It will be creating a body of masses. It will create a nuisance that affects your enjoyment of the land without causing harm. If you live near a shop, as an example, that can create noise. People are going, if it's a busy shop, people will be coming and going, they may be laughing, joking, playing music. It will be an annoyance. It may affect your enjoyment, but you have to acknowledge, it has to be acknowledged that it is a shop. It has business. If there's construction and small-scale construction or non-commercial construction, home renovations, home repairs, that can result in discomfort of neighbors. That this has to be taken into account. You don't do home renovations in the middle of the night. You don't have a jackhammer going at 2 in the morning, for example. And I say this now as there's renovations being done in the back garden. I'm not going to show you, it's no point. But it is again, the give and take of living in a society. And it is a question of construction does create a personal discomfort, but neighbors can't really complain, or they can complain, but they can't sue for nuisance because it's during reasonable hours. The volume isn't obnoxious, and it is being done with a set purpose. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it is permissible. But this isn't a perfect wrap up of is a claim nuisance or not. And I should have taken a defense there. But it's not going to be absolute. It's just going to be a guiding principle of how we determine the give and take, the live and let live approach for private nuisance and the enjoyment of one's land, or the restrictions of your enjoyment of land. And you can see there that Bella versus Cement Limited said, I do not think that we are entitled to deprive the plaintiff of his legal right on some idea of public convenience. So this is where we're looking at the balancing of it. Should you be able to lose your right to your enjoyment of land just because there's a shop? Should that shop be able to open 24 hours? And this is an example on the next slide. Next set of cases where we're looking at the character. But should a shop be allowed 24 hours? What would that entail? And you can see that the courts are reluctant to listen to plead the public benefit where the injury to the plaintiff is out of the ordinary effects on the sites. Where it's going beyond what could be reasonably expected. There's a shift, for example, there's a shop. If it's unreasonable that the shop is selling so much of its products late at night, I'm not talking after 11 onwards or after midnight, to cater to pub crowds, and they could easily sell during the day. The courts have to look at that, and it's out of the injury is out of the ordinary. So the hours in particular there are the key aspects. And the courts are conscious of the fact as well, what may be ordinary in one part of a city may be unusual for another. And this is not just in a city, but also in residential versus areas, urban versus rural again. The courts have to look at what is broader context of the neighborhood, effectively. And I use say city there because one of the cases we'll be looking at now is what is the character of a neighborhood? And this is more for urban areas than rural. But what is the character of a neighborhood? Is it a domestic area? Is it a residential area? Is it a commercial or residential mix? Or is it purely commercial? And when they were looking at this, they were looking at the new Imperial Windsor Hotel Cove versus Johnson. And they were looking at one of the necessary incidents of the social life of an industrial city is a certain amount of recreation and innocent amusing taken from a gathering of respectable young men and women who do so in large proportions on the daily work of the city. So going out at night, should that be part of if there's a dedicated area for pubs or recreational areas in cities, how do you draw nuisance there if you happen to live in those areas? Or if an area become open, if there's a lot of people out after a night out, outside of pubs, and you happen to live beside one, can you claim the entirety of your enjoyment of the land is compromised? Or is that a broader part of the give and take of a city that you move next to a pub, you have to acknowledge pubs will let out at certain hours, people will be intoxicated and loud, pubs will do their best or should be doing their best to try and mitigate this, but it doesn't always work. And there is that give and take, and just be aware of the context where the give and take is taking place. And you can see there in the case here, this is a case about a 24-hour shop in O'Kane versus Campbell. And they're looking at the idea again of the neighborhood and how it should be classified or characterized. And the shop itself was on a junction, I can't remember the name of streets, between two streets. One was a busy street by day, and by night it was a 24-hour shop. And the other was an old established residential street removed from the more busy places of the city. But because it was at the juncture, the corner, effectively, it was at the corner of the two streets, it was a 24-hour shop, and it was creating a noise for the residents, and particularly as these residents were elderly as a result of the nature of the city. Uh, it was creating noise and disturbing them, and significantly interfering with their enjoyment of their land. And the court looked at this. The court looked at this and said the noise was normal and inevitable as a result of the ordinary law-abiding people. That it was just the hustle and bustle that got to and from of going to a shop, going out of a shop, customers in a shop, customers not in a shop. But you can see there that the Lynch J was satisfied on the evidence that the trading carried on through the night had drastically altered the meaning of the Glengarriff Parade as a residential street. So the residential aspects at night was experiencing significant and substantial interference with their enjoyment of their premises, that at night the quiet area was no longer quiet. And because of this, it was a nuisance, and it was held to be that while the defendants could trade during the day, at night it was an unfair interference, that their use and enjoyment of land was so much more than their neighbours, and they had to find a compromise. And the compromise was it couldn't sell between the hours of, I think, 11 till 6 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. So it was no longer allowed to be a 24-hour shop. But what they could still have late night trading, they could still have early morning trading, but between those hours they couldn't sell. And that was a reasonable compromise, while not overly restricting the enjoyment and of the land and the commercial engagement of the shop venue. And the other one is if there's no good conduct, if there's no good purpose, if to defend its conduct, it will be a nuisance. If they're doing it just to cause a problem, if they're doing it just to be a little shit, effectively, reflection from the construction just blinded me, it will cause nuisance. If they're doing it to cause hassle, it will be a nuisance. If they're causing annoyance to their neighbours, it will take into account. And what could have been considered a reasonable activity with the intention of causing a disruption will then become a nuisance. And this was seen in Christie versus Davy, where annoyance, and I use the annoyance, was created by annoyance to the defendant was created by late night music lessons. The defendant complained to the plaintiff that your late night music lessons are causing a disruption. But they were done at late night. There was a reason. It was the only hours the person could teach, and they did their best to mitigate the noise. But the defendant complained, and he eventually started making noise to mock the lessons, playing some instrument or music out of tune, mocking notes. And the plaintiff then sued his neighbour for interfering with his enjoyment of the land, his ability to teach his music classes in peace, from this mocking noise. And it was held to have been nuisance because the utility of the defendant's conduct was just to frustrate. He was doing it to piss off his neighbour. And while he was creating the same noise, or reasonably similar noise, to the music lessons, the fact he was doing it to annoy the neighbour, to annoy the teacher of the music lessons, that was enough to make his noise nuisance and the music lessons to be the ordinary course of business and the ordinary course of the use of the land. And this is a quote there. Pretty much, if it's not, it's legitimate. It was not a legitimate use of the defendant's house to use it for the purpose of vexing and annoying his neighbours. So if he was just bad on music and he was playing it late at night, that would have been fine. The neighbours could have been annoyed and complained, but it may not have been a nuisance. But the fact he was deliberately playing the wrong notes, that he was deliberately playing the music in a mocking manner, it wasn't jazz. It wasn't. And it wasn't music. It wasn't a commentary. It was just noise for the sake of annoyance and frustration of the neighbour. That was a nuisance, and in that case, it wasn't allowed. And then we'll have to look at the idea of the gravity of harm. The courts have stressed that some allowance should be made for ordinary instances of neighbourly relations. The injury must be of substantial character and not fleeting or aggressive. It has to be something beyond my neighbour accidentally played the music too loud, realised the stereo was up to 11 and turned it down. That's an annoyance, that's uncomfortable, but again, it's part of the cityscape. It's part of giving forth the live and let live. If they continually do this, that's different. But if they put the music up too loud once and turn it down quickly, that's just how life goes. And you can see there the courts were looking at it. In Mullins versus Hayes, the HGJ referred the unwillingness of the court to grant relief where the damage claimed in respect is trivial, fanciful, or exaggerated inconvenience. So it's an annoyance to you. It's not enough to actually cause harm or really interfere with your enjoyment of the land. But at the same time, this does not mean the courts should ignore certain characteristics of the plaintiff when they're making their cases. And that was what they were looking at in relation to O'Kane versus Campbell with the 24-hour shop. That elderly people perhaps sleep more lightly than young people, but they are not normal for that, and they are entitled to their sleep at night. So while old people might wake up earlier, generalizing, not all people do, but people are entitled to their sleep at night, whether they're old or not, whether they're a light sleeper or a heavy sleeper, that still can cause the required nuisance. There still can be the gravity of harm pushing beyond between a trivial, fanciful, or exaggerated inconvenience. And once there is this significant harm, once they can show the gravity of the situation is of material nature, and it is causing damages to the property, or it's causing ridiculously substantial interference with the enjoyment of the property, the courts can disregard the competing characteristics of the public benefit that is a shop or the characteristics of a neighborhood that it's allowed to be. When the courts can justify it, they can ignore remove these criteria or mitigate these criteria, that they are no longer valid excuses for why this nuisance should be allowed. And this is what they were really looking at. So when we're looking at this is going to be the last thing we'll be looking at because they're not a bit quicker today. But when we're looking at the idea of nuisance, we have to ask who can actually bring a claim for. And traditionally, the rules before was extended, as I said at the start, only the occupier may sue in respect of interference with the land. This then, the occupier then could also apply for tenants in possession. So it's the landlord and the tenants if they have the property. However, a person who uses the land without possession of it or has any proprietary interest may not have an action. And this was the traditional rule. So family members of the owner of a house, if they're being annoyed, if they're having a nuisance, they can't sue. Invited guests, long-term, short-term, they won't have an action. But the courts decided, nah, that doesn't work. And they've shown a willingness, and more so recently, because everything changes. But the courts have looked beyond this, and they have shown a willingness to engage with beyond the traditional ownership question. And while they acknowledge this, they don't often explicitly acknowledge it. And that was in the Hanrahan versus Mark Sharp case, that the son and daughter-in-law of the registered owner of the premises were entitled to sue for a claim of nuisance, as well as the owner, while they didn't flat out say, as a result of you being the son and daughter-in-law, you can sue. They did allow the two individuals who happen to be the son and the daughter-in-law. So just bear in mind, the courts may not be as explicit as they should be in some cases, but they are pushing this line of expansion forward. In this UK case, then, in the Hunter versus Canary Wharf, it's interesting, it shows a distinction in the next page, where they sought to reverse this trend to those who have a right to the land affected. There was an attempt that was inconsistent. There was an attempt to do so, but the majority opposed the extension of the action, not only on the grounds that it was inconsistent with the true nature of the tort of private nuisance. So they were worried the expansions were going too far. And it's the question of just how the English courts were looking at it and trying to protect it from getting too far out of hand. This then, you can contrast this with the Irish, the two Irish cases there, and just how they kind of treat differently. A Royal Society, Government Society versus Yates, a different, a more flexible approach appears to be taken on the issue of the right to sue, but in that case, they didn't really go into why there is that difference and why that difference exists. And they were kind of following that up in Malumbi versus Kearns, where you can see the defendant argued that that certain of the plaintiffs lack of standing to sue in the private nuisance because he had not sufficiently shown that they had a legal interest in the property in question. But they're sort of trying to get the case dismissed by saying you don't have ownership. And O'Sullivan J rejected this argument, saying that he had accepted that the plaintiff had a valid claim, that they had standing, that they had a locus standi, was established because they were the occupier. And I do not think it is necessary for the plaintiffs to establish a legal interest over and above this. So while they may not have owned it, they were the occupier at the time, and that was enough for the case to go forward. So we're going to stop there just before we get too ahead. That's for the slide for Friday. So